In 2005, a group of executives from a company that had gone bankrupt 9 years earlier walked into Merrill Lynch and asked for $525 million. Their collateral was not real estate or equipment or cash flow. It was the film rights to 10 comic book characters that almost no one outside a comic shop had heard of: Captain America, Nick Fury, Doctor Strange, Hawkeye. Merrill Lynch said yes. 3 years later, one of those characters would open a film to over $100 million in a single weekend. 6 years after that, the company would sell for $4 billion, and within a decade, the franchise built from those 10 names would become the highest-grossing film series in the history of cinema. The answer starts in 1939, in a small office in Manhattan, where a pulp magazine publisher hired his wife's teenage cousin to fill inkwells. Martin Goodman ran a publishing company built on quantity, not quality. Pulp westerns, romance magazines, detective stories, cheap paper, fast turnaround, whatever sold. In 1939, he launched Timely Comics with Marvel Comics #1, which introduced the Human Torch and the Submariner. It sold nearly 900,000 copies. Goodman saw the numbers and kept printing. The teenager he hired was Stanley Lieber, 16 years old, working for family rather than pay. Within 2 years, the regular editor left after a royalty dispute, and Lieber, now calling himself Stan Lee, became interim editor of the entire comics line. He was 19. For 20 years, nothing remarkable happened. The company cycled through names and genres. Atlas Comics through the 1950s, monster stories, romance, westerns, whatever the market wanted that month. Lee stayed because he had nowhere else to go. Then, in 1961, everything changed. Lee and an artist named Jack Kirby, who had been drawing for Goodman's company on and off since the 1940s, created the Fantastic Four. Kirby could produce 6 to 8 finished pages a day. He worked from a basement in Long Island, drawing with a cigar in his mouth and the TV on, filling every panel with more detail than anyone had ever put into a 20-cent comic book. Within 2 years, Lee and Kirby produced Thor, Iron Man, the X-Men, the Hulk, and the Avengers. Lee and another artist, Steve Ditko, created Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. In a burst of creativity that lasted roughly 24 months, 2 men invented characters that would eventually generate over $30 billion in film revenue alone. But every one of those characters was created under a work-for-hire agreement that meant Marvel owned everything. Not Lee, not Kirby, not Ditko. The company That Legal Trap, set quietly in the 1960s, would not be challenged for another 50 years. And when it finally was, the outcome would say more about the American entertainment industry than any Marvel film ever could. Kirby was paid by the page. He received no ownership, no royalties, no equity. Goodman sold Marvel to a conglomerate called Cadence Industries in 1968. He retired in 1972, never fully understanding what his company had become. Lee was promoted to publisher and moved to Los Angeles to develop film deals that went nowhere for decades. Kirby left in 1970, bitter about credit and compensation, returned in 1975, and died in 1994. Without ever receiving royalties from any character he created. The intellectual property sat there for 15 years, accumulating cultural value, while changing corporate hands like luggage on a carousel, until a financier finally noticed what everyone else had been too close to see. In January 1989, Ronald Perelman bought Marvel Entertainment Group for $82.5 million through his holding company, McAndrews & Forbes. Perelman was not a comic book fan. He was a specialist in buying struggling companies, loading them with debt, and taking the cash for himself. He looked at Marvel and saw what he called a mini Disney in terms of intellectual property. He was right about the value. He was wrong about what to do with it. Perelman took Marvel public in 1991 at $16.50 per share, raising $40 million. By 1993, the stock had climbed to nearly $35, and the company's market capitalization approached $1 billion. But instead of investing in the characters, Perelman built a financial machine designed to extract money upward through a chain of holding companies. The structure was elegant in its cynicism. Above Marvel Entertainment Group sat Marvel Holdings. Above that, Marvel Parent Holdings. Above that, Marvel 3 Holdings. Above that, McAndrews & Forbes. At each level, Perelman's entities issued bonds secured by Marvel stock. The proceeds flowed up. The risk stayed down. If your eyes are glazing over at the names, that was exactly the point. The structure was designed so that no one, not the bondholders, not the regulators, not Marvel's own employees, could easily trace where the money was going. Between 1993 and 1994, The holding companies issued over $500 million in bonds. Perelman used the cash to buy everything adjacent to Marvel that he could find. He bought trading card companies and sticker publishers and toy manufacturers. He bought 46% of a company called Toy Biz. And he bought Heroes World Distribution in an attempt to control how Marvel's comics reached stores, a move that would disrupt the entire industry's supply chain before collapsing. All of it financed by the same collateral, Marvel stock. Marvel stock that was only worth what it was worth because people believed the acquisitions would pay off. The comic book speculation bubble burst in 1994. Variant covers and foil editions had driven artificial demand from speculators who bought 5 copies of every issue expecting them to become collectible. When secondary market prices collapsed, the speculators vanished and took the revenue with them. The 1994 baseball strike simultaneously destroyed the trading card business. Heroes World Distribution failed so thoroughly that comic shops across the country lost their supply lines. Marvel's stock fell from $35 to under $3. The bonds were suddenly secured by almost nothing. On December 27, 1996, Marvel Entertainment Group and 9 affiliated entities filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in Delaware. 10 companies, 1 filing. The largest comic book publisher in America, the owner of Spider-Man and the X-Men and Captain America, was unable to pay its debts. Ronald Perelman's mini Disney was insolvent. 275 employees were laid off on January 4, 1997. The offices in Manhattan that had produced the most recognizable characters in American popular culture were half empty. The stock that had traded at $35 3 years earlier was worth less than a cup of coffee. The bankruptcy was not the end. It was the beginning of a fight for control of the company, and it would determine whether the characters survived as a business or got carved up and sold for parts. Carl Icahn had been buying Marvel's holding company bonds at roughly 20 cents on the dollar throughout 1996, accumulating approximately 1/3 of the outstanding debt. He saw what Perelman had seen 7 years earlier. The characters were still worth something. The company around them was the problem. Perelman wanted to retain control by merging Toy Biz into Marvel. Icahn wanted to convert the bonds to equity at ratios that would give bondholders control instead. The fight generated 6 separate court opinions and consumed more in legal fees than some of the characters were licensed for. And during the bankruptcy, Marvel did something that would define the next 2 decades of entertainment. Desperate for any revenue, the company licensed its most famous characters to film studios at prices that reflected the company's desperation, not the characters' value. Spider-Man went to Sony for what was reportedly $7 million. The X-Men went to Fox for comparable terms. Characters that would go on to generate over $4 billion in box office revenue for Sony alone. The people making these deals were not stupid. They were bankrupt. There is a difference, but in the moment, it does not feel like one. The bankruptcy resolved in 1998 when Toy Biz merged with the remnants of Marvel to form Marvel Enterprises. Ike Perlmutter, an Israeli-born businessman who had co-founded Toy Biz with a toy industry executive named Avi Arad, took operational control. The New York Stock Exchange had already delisted Marvel's shares. Perlmutter ran Marvel like a man who never wanted to see a bankruptcy filing again. He slashed everything. Corporate overhead disappeared. Toy manufacturing was outsourced entirely to Hong Kong. The stories from inside Marvel's offices during this period have become legend. Perlmutter reportedly monitored office supply usage personally. The company operated at near minimum staffing levels. Every dollar that did not directly generate revenue was eliminated. But beneath the cost-cutting, something extraordinary was happening. Sony released Spider-Man in 2002. It earned $804 million worldwide on a budget of $139 million. Fox released X-Men in 2000 and X2 in 2003. Both were massive hits. And Marvel, which owned the characters these films were built on, collected only licensing royalties, a fraction of the profits determined by formulas designed to minimize what the licensor received. In 2002, Marvel's licensing revenue was $57 million. By 2004, driven by Spider-Man 2, it reached $214 million. But Marvel was watching studios earn billions from characters it had created, while it collected checks that were large by any normal standard and insulting by the standard of what those characters were actually generating. Then, in 2006, Marvel earned only $351 million in total revenue. The reason was simple. No major Marvel film had released that year. The company's entire financial trajectory depended on whether Sony or Fox decided to make a movie in a given year. Marvel controlled the intellectual property but not its own destiny. This was the problem that 2 men decided to solve. David Maisel joined Marvel Studios in 2004 as chairman. Kevin Feige had been there since 2000, hired at 26 as an associate producer on the first X-Men film. Feige had spent years mapping which character rights Marvel still controlled and which were locked at other studios. What he found was that Marvel's most commercially proven characters, Spider-Man, X-Men, Fantastic Four, were gone. But a roster of less famous characters remained: Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, the Avengers, Black Panther, Doctor Strange. Maisel looked at those characters and saw something no one else did. Not a collection of B-list properties, but the raw materials for a self-financed film studio. He spent months blocking attempts by other Marvel executives to license Captain America and Thor to outside studios. Every character sold was a character Marvel could never use itself. The idea was radical. Marvel would stop licensing characters and start producing its own films. It would borrow the production budget from Wall Street, using the character rights themselves as collateral. If the films succeeded, Marvel would keep the profits instead of watching Sony and Fox collect them. If the films failed, the lenders would seize fictional characters that had already proven commercially worthless to everyone except the company that created them. In September 2005, the deal was announced. Merrill Lynch arranged a $525 million facility, $465 million in senior debt, rated AAA through an insurance guarantee from AMBAC, $60 million in mezzanine debt. They set up a separate company just for the movies, structured so that if the films bombed, the lenders could never touch Marvel's parent company. The risk was contained to exactly 10 characters. Paramount Pictures signed on as distributor, taking a fee of roughly 8 to 10% rather than the 50% or more that a studio would normally keep as producer. Marvel retained all merchandising revenue and all net profits above the debt service. Avi Arad, who had spent a decade licensing characters to other studios, announced the deal with pride. But within a year, he was gone. Kevin Feige was promoted to president of production in March 2007. He had a vision that went beyond individual films. He wanted to connect them. Iron Man began production with a $186 million budget. Everything Marvel had built since emerging from bankruptcy. The Perlmutter cost discipline, the Maisel financing structure, the Feige creative vision was riding on this single film. If it failed, the lenders could seize the characters, not just Iron Man, all 10. The lead actor was a man that half of Hollywood considered uninsurable. Robert Downey Jr. had spent years cycling through rehab programs and county jail. Tom Cruise and Vin Diesel had been considered for the role. Studios wanted a safe choice. Feige wanted Downey because he understood something about the character that a safe choice never could. Tony Stark was a man rebuilding himself from the wreckage of his own worst decisions. So was Downey. On May 2, 2008, Iron Man opened to $102 million in its first weekend. It earned $585 million worldwide. The film production segment of Marvel's annual report that year showed $254 million in revenue from just 2 films, Iron Man and The Incredible Hulk. In a single year, self-produced films nearly matched the peak licensing revenue that had taken Spider-Man and all other characters combined to generate. But it was what happened after the credits that changed everything. Samuel L. Jackson appeared on screen as Nick Fury and told Tony Stark about something called the Avenger Initiative. It was a 30-second scene that promised viewers these films were connected, that they were building towards something larger. No studio had ever attempted this. Sequels existed, franchises existed, but a shared cinematic universe, where characters from separate films would eventually appear together in a single massive crossover, had never been tried at this scale. Feige had been planning it since 2000. On August 31, 2009, the Walt Disney Company announced it would acquire Marvel Entertainment for approximately $4 billion, $50 per share, $30 in cash, plus 0.745 Disney shares for each Marvel share. Disney's chief executive Robert Iger called it a combination of Marvel's strong global brand and world-renowned library of characters with Disney's creative skills and unparalleled global portfolio. Perelman had bought Marvel for $82.5 million 20 years earlier, extracted over $500 million in bond proceeds, driven it into bankruptcy, and reportedly settled bondholder claims for around $80 million. The bondholders who had trusted Perelman's holding company structure lost hundreds of millions. The creators who had drawn the characters lost everything, and now Disney was paying $4 billion for what emerged from the wreckage. Perlmutter, the man who had counted paperclips and refused to invest in anything he could not measure, had taken control of a bankrupt company and built it into a $4 billion exit. He became one of Disney's largest individual shareholders. Perlmutter remained as chief executive under Disney, But the arrangement carried a structural tension that would take 6 years to break. Perlmutter believed in cost control and cautious investment. Feige believed in creative ambition and scale. The conflict intensified through 2014 and 2015, reportedly centering on film budgets, diversity in casting, and the scope of the cinematic universe. When Sony's corporate emails were leaked in November 2014, they included messages from Perlmutter arguing against female-led and black-led superhero films. In late 2015, Disney restructured Marvel Studios to report directly to Walt Disney Studios chairman Alan Horn, bypassing Perlmutter entirely. Feige had full creative authority. Perlmutter retained his title but lost the studio. He was formally dismissed in 2023 after backing an activist investors' proxy fight against Disney's board. On May 4, 2012, The Avengers opened to $207 million in its first weekend, the largest opening in history at that time. It earned $1.52 billion worldwide. On April 26, 2019, Avengers Endgame opened to $357 million and earned $2.8 billion worldwide, briefly becoming the highest-grossing film ever made. The 10 characters that Merrill Lynch had accepted as collateral in 2005 had generated a franchise worth over $30 billion in box office revenue. Jack Kirby drew Captain America in 1941. He drew the Fantastic Four in 1961. He drew Thor, Iron Man, the Hulk, Black Panther, and the Avengers in the 24 months that followed. He was paid by the page. He died in 1994 without royalties, and when his heirs filed copyright termination notices in 2009, attempting to reclaim ownership of characters Kirby had drawn for page rates in the 1960s, Marvel sued to have the notices invalidated. The case went to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which ruled in 2013 that all of Kirby's work was made for hire under the 1909 Copyright Act. The characters belonged to Marvel. They always had. The Kirby heirs petitioned the Supreme Court. Every major creative union in Hollywood filed briefs supporting them. Days before the court was scheduled to consider the case, Marvel settled for undisclosed terms. The amount has never been made public. The characters Kirby created have since earned Disney over $30 billion in film revenue alone. Stan Lee fared only slightly better. His 1998 employment contract entitled him to 10% of net profits from films based on his characters. After Spider-Man earned over $800 million and Marvel paid him nothing, Lee sued. The case settled in 2005 for $10 million. A decade later, Lee was 95 years old and unable to protect himself. His manager drained $1.4 million from his bank accounts. Another associate purchased an $850,000 condominium with Lee's funds. A memorabilia dealer was charged with 6 felony elder abuse counts for isolating Lee from his family. The criminal case ended in a mistrial. Neither Kirby nor Lee ever received compensation proportional to what their creations generated. The system, from Goodman through Perelman through Perlmutter through Disney, worked exactly as designed. The corporation owned the intellectual property. The creators were paid for their time. The gap between those two things grew to $30 billion. In 1989, Ronald Perelman called Marvel a mini Disney in terms of intellectual property. He identified the value correctly. He destroyed it anyway. Martin Goodman never understood what he had built. Perelman tried to strip mine it. ICANN tried to trade it. Perlmutter tried to run it cheaply forever. It took Kevin Feige, a 26-year-old hired to assist on a single X-Men film, to understand that the value was not in licensing the characters or cutting costs or extracting dividends. The value was in telling their stories. The characters that no one wanted became the most valuable franchise on Earth, and the people who created them received, in the end, almost nothing.